While many find these to be very challenging times, some people are thriving. Why are those folks doing well, and what could the rest of us learn from them? Let's ask. In San Francisco, California, Dr. Daphne Miller, a family physician at the University of California, San Francisco. And here in the provincial capital, in downtown Toronto, there's Dr. Roger McIntyre, professor of psychiatry and pharmacology at the University of Toronto. And it's great to have you two both aboard. Hope you're doing well during this pandemic. And I want to find out, Roger, why don't you start us off? Why do you think the three guests we just talked to are faring rather well and have certainly found the silver lining in this pandemic when so many other people are reporting quite the opposite?
Well, I think this is such a critical part, Steve, that we need to focus on. And I think what we heard from our guests is resiliency. And resiliency still in our world of psychiatry and psychology remains a difficult construct to fully operationalize. But the way we tend to think about it is along several dimensions. And I think our guests probably illustrated some of that. People, in fact, who are more resilient to crises or to stressors, especially unpredictable, seemingly never-ending stressors, often tell us that they have a sense of locus of control, an internal versus an external locus of control. They are in feeling they can take power over the event in front of them. Secondly, people who tend to be more resilient have what we would call a greater repertoire of responding. We all have a drop-down menu, how we respond to events externally and internally. People who are more resilient have a broader and more lengthier drop-down menu. And finally, which is important, they have the ability to select the most adaptive way of responding. So an internal locus of control, having a broader way of relating, and having chief executive officer status over how you react gives you what we call positive adaptation. And I think what you've heard spoken to quite eloquently is positive adaptation. And we have as much to learn about that as we do about the vulnerability to stress and mental illness during these times.
Hmm. Daphne, what percentage of your patients would you say are feeling like CEOs in their own world these days versus those who aren't?
I would say relatively few, yeah, are feeling like CEOs, and that the what was just stated is absolutely correct. But one of the things that we cannot ignore is how much our external environment and our privilege in life can lead to that sense of resiliency. And right now with this pandemic, probably one of the biggest things that sorts people from who are doing well from those who are not is whether they have a job or not, what their economic outlook looks like. And if they do have a job, is it a job that makes them feel safe, or is it one that is putting them out there in the world in a way that feels unsafe and they feel forced to do it? So while there certainly are personality and internal factors that can lead to resilience or not, what we're unfortunately seeing with this pandemic is that so many of the inequities that are in our society are creating even a deeper wedge during this event.
No, to be sure. And our previous guests all pointed out that financially at the moment, they're all in reasonably secure shape. So they're not worrying about where their next meal is coming from. So obviously that makes a difference. But perhaps, Daphne, let me follow up with you on this. Most
Sure.
parents I talk to say they are they are really stressed out and at their wits' end to figure out how to engage their children for 12 hours a day now, whereas in the past they might have only had to do it for a few. We heard from our previous guests who said they loved all this extra time with their kids and were really making the most of it. What do you think accounts for that?
It's that also can be sort of dependent on the resources that you have and so on. I certainly have heard from families that have felt like you know having the shutdown has brought them all together, made them closer. I've seen couples in my practice who really might have actually been not doing so well before and have learned new ways to communicate and reconnect. Parents who are sinking into parenting in a new way. But on the other side, seeing many families who are very stressed by this.
Well, Roger, let me follow up with that. When it comes to mental health, what concerns you the most right now about what you're hearing?
Well, the phrase in public health has been often, bandied about that your zip code means more to your health and disease than does your genetic code. And I agree with the comment earlier about employment. This is the greatest shock to mental health, certainly in my lifetime as a person or a professional. I describe it, Steve, as the trifecta. We have an unending anxiety related to this biomedical threat. We have the insecurity of employment and finance. And thirdly, we have quarantine and stay at home orders. All three are hazards to mental health. Just recently, we've published two separate papers. One was an analysis of data we extracted from the Department of Labor in the United States, as well as statistics from here in Canada. And we projected out in a model the expected increase in the number of suicides that will occur unless we get ahead of the curve as a consequence of COVID. So we talk about flattening curves. That's not the sentence. It's flattening the curve and preventing the curve of suicide and mental illness related to suicide, like depression. And this is something that's now being observed in other parts of the world. So we've heard about deaths of despair in America, deaths of despair, suicide related to opioid and alcohol in financial distress. This is now added to the deaths of despair. And Steve, you'd be aware of the fact that we've lost 3 million jobs in Canada in 8 weeks. That has erased 15 years of job accumulation in 8 weeks. The Wall Street Journal is reporting just this week that in Canada, 20% of Canadians are going to be in a situation of forbearance on their mortgages. So there is distress here in Canada. The US is seeing a similar level of distress, and we're already seeing an uptick in the prescription of psychiatric medications related to depression and anxiety. So we have an echo pandemic. And as I said, this is the greatest assault that we've seen on record in my time.
Daphne, in which case, again, we heard our previous guest talk about this. How important is it to have, you know, the guest told us they were taking care of themselves, that they were exercising regularly, that they were eating better now, cooking better food, et cetera, et cetera. How important is all of that to staving off mental health issues, to maintaining good health, et cetera?
It is. It's a very important, once again, something that you need the resources to do. But I have noticed, aside from a job being one of the biggest predictors of how my patients are doing, it's having actually the physical space to be able to go outside and feel safe and not like you're going to expose somebody else or be exposed. And so, as you can see behind me, I'm so lucky. I live in Berkeley, California, a place where we have a lot of space, and in fact have had in my zip code no reported infections, which is kind of crazy.
Wow.
Uh, and it's literally because of the fact that we have so much space to roam around here. We've got hills we can go hiking in. And all of that can lead to a real sense of wellness, even in the shutdown. But in places where there's very high density and not that opportunity to have space, it certainly can feel confining as well. There are some programs that cities are doing, which I think are really wonderful, like the open streets. I think that's the term they're using, where they're actually not allowing cars on certain corridors. I don't know if that's happening in Toronto. They're doing that in San Francisco, so that people can really just walk down the middle of the street and have more space that way. But that is actually a really important resource right now, is nature and being outside. And I think it really is helping with the mental health piece.
Yeah, I think one of the things they're talking about here is not necessarily banning traffic on streets, but if there were 4 lanes of traffic, narrowing them to 2 and expanding the sidewalks figuratively to allow more people space as opposed to car space. I want to read something from a Psychology Today column. This was written by a couple of Australian professors of psychology, and then I'll get you two to comment on it. It goes like this. In a recent study, extroverts and introverts were asked to spend a week engaging in higher levels of extrovert typical behavior, being talkative, sociable, etc. Extroverts reaped several benefits, including enhanced mood and feelings of authenticity. Conversely, introverts experienced no benefits and reported feeling tired and irritable. The social distancing rules to which we're all trying to adhere are like a mirror image of this intervention. Now it's the extroverts who are acting out of character and who will likely experience decreased well being in the coming weeks and months. Introverts, on the other hand, well, they've been training for this moment their whole lives. Roger, I guess it raises the question of how one's natural disposition contributes to how well or poorly you're going to do at a time like this. What do you say about that?
Well, I think ultimately that's what it's going to come down to. It's going to come down to the combination of what our colleague in Berkeley is saying in terms of social resiliency, and I agree with the comment about a job, as well as individual resiliency. And I articulated three aspects of individual resiliency: the locus of control, the repertoire of relating, and being able to select the most appropriate and most adaptive response. And of course, this is in the context of social factors. What I would say to that is that I think it's a bit more complicated. I think we agree on that with respect to what this is about. There's another aspect that I think sort of segues into this, and that is the aspect of the loneliness epidemic. You know, we prefaced this pandemic with an epidemic of loneliness. And many people who are described as lonely, or they would describe themselves as lonely, would be referred to others as being, in fact, introverts. They may be introverts, but they may not be introverts. And they may be, in fact, finding themselves in a default position. And you could conjecture that the incredible social reconfiguration that's taking place in the last 8 to 12 weeks may have a positive externality for some people. Some people, maybe who are older or younger, any age of life, but maybe older or younger, who didn't find themselves with the same or similar opportunities to be connected to people than they are now. That's a testable hypothesis, which I think is reasonable and might align in part with that statement from the notion that an introvert might be better off in some ways. It's obviously an overly simplified framework, introverts and extroverts, but I do think it's actually an interesting idea that some people may find themselves for the first time in a long time more connected than they once were. But be careful what you ask for, Steve, because we just finished a study in China. We interviewed just shy of 3,000 people in China, including Wuhan, and we looked at what was the role of social media in terms of connecting with people. We found something which was aligned with a broader literature about social media, and it's something that we were taught as kids: too much or too little of anything is not good for you. Social media in a previous literature has been linked to loneliness and linked to negative mental health outcomes. In China, what we found was people who used extensive social media as their primary way to socially engage were more likely to report depression, anxiety, stress, more likely to report a decrease in well-being. So we talk about portion control with respect to food and alcohol, which is an immunosuppressant, but portion control also refers to social media. So I think that, in fact, one certainly wants to connect, but we want to connect to the familiar. Perhaps connecting too much to the unfamiliar does more harm than good.
Interesting. Daphne, I wonder if it does raise the question about that slogan we hear all the time: we're all in this together. When you hear that, what comes to mind?
Uh, I think that on some level there has been an increase in solidarity that I have felt, in people really, strangers helping each other. And I've been really fascinated with our local social network, the Nextdoor. I don't know if you have that in Canada, but a place where people post things that they need or trying to find a plumber or what have you. And it's incredible how many strangers are stepping up to help each other. And so that feels very lovely. But I also think what was just said is true as well, that there are, for some people, an increasing sense of isolation. I think, when this merry-go-round stopped, people who were single or living alone, a lot of them have truly been alone for weeks and weeks now. As I'm seeing patients virtually mostly, but I am also seeing patients face to face, that is something that I'm hearing over and over again, is I haven't, been in the same room or touched another human for weeks now. And we are creatures, whether we're introverts or extroverts. We are creatures who enjoy another human, and this is a very hard thing.
Well, one of the things that came up with our previous guests was the notion that life before was quite a rat race, and they have certainly noticed a difference right now in terms of work life balance. The consulting firm Robert Half in Canada did the following survey among 500 office workers, and let's share those numbers with you right now. 79% reported they were now working from home because of COVID-19, almost 8 in 10 people. 55% said their work life balance improved as a result of not having to commute. Parents were 20% more likely than their non parental peers to say that their work life balance had improved. And 85% of employees reported wanting the flexibility to work from home more often going forward. Many people, Roger, in this situation who work in offices are also now finding they are able to work from home. Is this a socioeconomic issue, this pandemic? I mean, it gets back to that slogan I was using before, we're all in this together. I mean, yes, but some people have got it a little bit easier than other people. Is this a socioeconomic issue at the end of the day?
It certainly is. It's also a gender issue in the sense that,
Right.
let me start off with the first one, that we know that individuals who are in the lower socioeconomic strata, they don't have the luxury of staying home. Actually, they often work in, economies that are in manufacturing and other areas. They have to be on site. They can't work virtually. So there's no doubt about that. And we've been hearing about this not just in the US and Canada, but elsewhere. It's highly gendered. 80% of the world's health care workforce is women, according to the World Health Organization. Women are overrepresented in the so-called face-to-face economy. In other words, retail and food and industry, food and entertainment industries, and so on. And I think that's one part that segues into a point related to those set of statistics. You see, Vivek Murthy was the Surgeon General within the Obama administration. He was one of the ones that really implicated the changing work environment as contributing to an increase in loneliness and stress. In other words, what he felt was that America is going through a loneliness epidemic. It is, and we see this in other countries. And he really implicated the fact that people working more in gig and virtual economies was putting some people in a better mental health position, but not everybody. And unfortunately, women end up taking on more and more responsibilities, especially when they're working from home. And so a survey, Steve, conducted in Canada, Angus, the Ipsos Reid survey that was done just about a month ago, looked at anxiety and stress in Canada. Guess what? It's high, no surprise. Women reporting it higher, especially women who have kids at home. So, I think this needs to be treaded on very carefully. What I would say is that yes, the hybrid model seems very reasonable. I think that's already been happening. It's been amplified by this pandemic. And for some people, it is a better avenue and a better way to live their life, but not for everybody. And I think the reality is that women end up taking on more of the responsibility, and that's not often articulated.
We've got just a few minutes left here, and presumably at some point down the road, Daphne, we're going to all be confronted with what will be called a new normal. And I wonder if in the course of dealing with your patients, you have talked to them about what this new normal will look like and how we can best adjust to it.
That's a terrific question. It really is the $1 million question right now is what will it look like? And I think that the truth is that none of us quite know, which is a horrible thing for humans to actually not know where you're headed. And I think in terms of what's creating anxiety, that might be top on the list, is the great unknown. But it certainly is going to be a much more virtual world. I mean, I can speak for medicine. I'm in primary care, and we're going through a massive reorganization in my university hospital right now because we realize that virtual medicine is here to stay. I mean, we were doing, less than 1% of our visits this way before the pandemic, and we were sort of thinking of this 10-year rollout to become more virtual. And literally overnight, it happened where we flipped things on its head, and over 90% of our visits in primary care became that. And now I'm about to get off this interview and start my clinic for the day and see a very packed schedule of patients who literally come into my waiting room, but they come into my virtual waiting room and what have you. So I know in my life things have changed dramatically, and it's a whole other way of practicing medicine and a whole other way of connecting to my patients. But obviously it's going to play out in the work that we all do and the way that we live our lives, the way we shop, the way we get even our exercise. I have so many patients now who are part of virtual clubs and virtual yoga classes and doing everything like that online as well. So yeah, we all anticipate that this is a very, very dramatic change to our life, but none of us quite know where we're headed.
Well, I can tell you, as somebody who's been doing virtual interviews for the last 9 weeks, it's the second best option. It's certainly better than not being on the air at all. But I sure do miss the days where I can actually look somebody in the eye at a studio and have a conversation with them. Hopefully that day will come before long. Dr. Daphne Miller at University of California, San Francisco, we want to thank you for being on the program. And on behalf of Raptor fans across Canada, well, I was going to say we apologize for the NBA Finals last year against Golden State, but we don't apologize at all. We're very happy with the outcome. And Dr. Roger McIntyre from the University of Toronto, it's always good to have you on our program. Thanks a lot, you two, and be safe.
You.
Thank you, Steve.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.